Hello, lovelies. You're listening to episode 28 of the Broken Enchantments podcast, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. That's me. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. Be sure to check out my Patreon for next week's episode, now available. You can check out the links below. Now let's get to the story. They left the next morning before sunrise. Janir was eager to begin their journey, even with the odd feeling of emptiness that came with Carlisle's absence. The air held a sharp bite, the early warnings that the snows would be coming soon. It came as an unpleasant shock when Armandius informed her at the crack of dawn that the Queen and her immediate household would be accompanying them, entrusted to Armandius just last night. When Janir railed with as much outrage as she could muster, Armandius had explained that this was a gesture of faith. The other High Lords, especially Meliard and Kessam, didn't particularly want him accompanying them in battle at the moment. This was the High King's compromise, to show trust in Armandius while making the others happy. Janir was still displeased until she realized that she had this honor to thank for her foster father staying out of war. This was the only reason he wasn't riding to battle, but it was hard to be grateful when no one else seemed eager to be gone. The Queen and her ladies-in-waiting were packed inside a boxy carriage covered with red canvas like so many crystal vases. Janir caught a glimpse as the Queen and her ladies were boarding. Gwenna was the most conservative of all the noble women when it came to personal decoration. She wore absolutely no jewelry, not that anyone with eyes would say she needed it. There were 5 wagons in all, each packed to bursting with assorted frivolities. Janir sat aboard Kalbo, patting his neck as servants eased the final crates into the wagons. She wasn't sure where Armandius was, but she had seen him some minutes before, arguing with the chief of the Queen's Knights. Armandius had said that they would leave at first light. Infuriatingly, it was mid-morning before the long procession eventually mobilized and creaked out the gates and onto a flat country road. Today, the High Queen was being relocated to Greenhaven. A few days later, the army was set to mobilize in Saradin and head for the Slavish border. War was coming. By a little after noon, Janir trudged along leading Kalbo. They were moving so bloody slow that there was no reason for her to ride him anyway. Janir decided a caterpillar might have a chance at turning into a butterfly before they were halfway there. Every time Armandius urged them to move faster, most the women in the Queen's retinue complained, and quite often the knights sided with them. "Finding it tedious, are you?" Seovan asked, walking his mare beside her. Janir wasn't sure why Seovan was coming with them. An elf with skills like his would normally be on the front lines of a war. Janir had no doubts that he was unafraid of battles, so that couldn't be it. Perhaps he was coming to keep an eye on the Queen. Not that she objected if he stayed around. Clearing her throat, she tried to push that dark thought aside. Are they planning on setting up a new palace? Janir motioned to the 5 wagons of stuff in the Queen's entourage. No, dear one. Seovan smiled a little. We are not making poor time at all. In fact, if we keep this rate, we should be back to Greenhaven within a fortnight. They were quiet as the creak of wagon wheels, the nicker of horses, and the plod of feet filled the silence for them. Ahead, Armandius and several other knights were also walking their horses to save the beast's strength. Janir knotted Kalbo's reins in her hands, digging her thumbnail into the leather. Is that why you're with us? To see that we make it on time? My king has ordered me to accompany the party to Greenhaven, and see that everyone remains safe. Seovan hesitated, barely an instant, but she noticed. She was afraid to press the matter. It seemed likely that the Elvish king had ordered him to keep an eye on her to make sure she didn't hurt anyone. She didn't want to make Seovan admit that. How old are you, Seovan? Janir spontaneously asked, not sure why that question had occurred to her. She had just wanted to change the subject. He glanced at her sideways. Why do you wish to know? Janir shrugged awkwardly. I was just thinking and realized that I have known you for years and know next to nothing about you. In solar years, I am 79, he said casually. You're 79? Janir squeaked in surprise, trying to remove the disappointment from her face. She was sorry she had asked. Though she had met him when she was 13, he had always spoken to her as an equal, and she had always considered him close to her own age. He looked like he was close to her age, but then again, Velasquez didn't look a day over 30. Now she learned that Seovan was old enough to be her great-grandfather. Janir's throat went dry. That's older than a lot of people around here? The elf's mouth tugged at her expression of shock. If it makes you any more comfortable with speaking to me. In your terms, I believe I am... Seovan peered at the sky for a moment as he calculated. Around 19. Oh. Janir cleared her throat, not sure why this seemed so awkward. Do you have any other family besides your father? As soon as she said it, she realized that might have been too probing a question. If you don't mind me asking. No, not in the least. Seovan wore the hints of a smile. My mother is back in the Sylvan Forests, and I have an older brother there as well. I also have an aunt who is an ascetic. An ascetic? Yes. She chose to swear her life to protecting the Creator's world rather than marrying. A warrior nun? Janir made a mental note to be thankful none of the Brevian enchantresses had such talents. What about your brother? Does he trouble himself with mortals as you and your father do? Janir meant it to sound at least half teasing, but a shadow passed over the elf. Hilben? No. He never developed our father's fondness for your kind, Seovan said. He stopped me leaving the Sylvan Forests until a few years ago. Did he tie you to a tree or something? Janir asked, trying to lighten the mood. He might as well have. Janir noticed the tightness in Seovan's jaw and decided to end the conversation. They stopped for the night in a green meadow that reminded Janir of the fields back home. There were no tents pitched. The wagons served that purpose. Armandius remained by himself, brooding unhappily. Seovan was nowhere to be seen, and Janir was sentenced to the company of the Queen and her ladies-in-waiting. Sitting with the women was better than being alone, but Janir still loathed every second spent in the company of the Queen and her ladies. The others were nothing like Gwenna at all. They talked about matchmaking and meaningless gossip. The country could very well be on the brink of war, and all they cared about was which lord might propose to which lady and what dowries and lands would be involved. Queen Liaris might have been comely at one time, but it seemed that she had grown pale and gaunt after having children and needed massive amounts of rouge to give color to her chalk-white features. All the same, her sickly appearance did nothing to keep her from chattering and laughing just as loud as the others. If there was one thing to be grateful for, Janir supposed that it would be that none of the royal couple's surviving children, the 4 nearly grown princesses, were being sent to Greenhaven too. They were all wintering on the coast of the Dawn Plains with their mother's relatives, probably playing in the sand and dallying with handsome knights, from what Hesty had told Janir. Janir now wished, not for the first time, that her mother were still alive. Maybe then Janir could have learned how to deal with such company. However, as things were, she could only deal with them as Armandius did. Smile and nod. In her boredom, she wondered what they would think of some of the things she had done. Fought a dragon, survived a shipwreck, killed a man. Her brow furrowed as she recalled Duke Ronan's soulless eyes gazing emptily off into space. She still dreamed about him sometimes. There came a commotion from the perimeter of the camp. The guards shouted indistinctly. The ladies-in-waiting stirred and whispered frantically. "Janir! Assistance! If you please!" cried a familiar voice. Janir used an unladylike word and marched in the direction of the cries. She ignored the protests from the ladies that she should stay here and let the guards handle it. By the trees, held between two armored guards. Carlyle flailed desperately. He looked the same as he always did, with his grungy, shapeless robe and skinny, unmuscled limbs.
"Janir, please make them let go," he screamed.
"What are you doing here?" she demanded. The knights cast her sharp looks. "You know him?" "He's Carl Kerwin, son of Sir Marcerian Kerwin."
"I've heard much of him,"
muttered the closest knight.
"What are you doing here?"
Janir snapped to Carlyle.
"Well, now that I've found you, I am hoping to not be squeezed to death by these big, clumsy—"
"Why are you following me?"
"Because—" the enchanter coughed. "Interesting things happen around you, and I want to be where things are interesting."
"What is happening here?"
demanded Armandius, striding up and surveying the scene in a quick, practiced manner.
"You again,"
Armandius grumbled, seeing who was held between the knights.
"I thought we had gotten rid of you."
"Hello again, Lord Kayerson."
"You may release him," Armandius commanded the knights. "I'll have him sent back to his father in the morning." His expression hardened. "Tied up in a sack if I must."
The guards reluctantly released Carlyle just as there came a shout from the other side of camp. "What was that?" Janir tensed. As if to answer her wonderings, a voice cried out, "Bandits!" "Did you bring them here?" Janir whirled on Carlyle.
"Of course not,"
he indignantly snapped.
"And how would I have managed that, anyway?"
Not heeding the pair, the two knights brandished their weapons and Armandius drew his sword, the third. The hilt of the third was wrapped in emerald green wire, and the light caught the steel blade, seeming to give the slightest emerald tinge to it. Janir realized she had seen Armandius draw it perhaps only twice before. The moment it was drawn, the blade fairly dazzled with ancient and old magic, weathered and worn, tested and untouched by time. Janir might have thought it gorgeous under different circumstances.
"Stay back, Janir," Armandius commanded.
He motioned for the knights to follow him and marched away, transformed into a general almost instantly, ready to lead, to order, to command, to kill. Obeying, Janir remained where she stood. At the presence of danger, her hands instinctively gravitated to the folds of her dress where her carcatan were hidden. These days she kept them with her whenever possible, as much for protection as the comfort they gave her. Carlyle surveyed the encampment curiously, drastically unconcerned as more bandits emerged from the trees. Janir watched as Armandius ran a brigand through with his gleaming sword. She looked away before she gagged. Seovan was fighting too, his sword flashing in the firelight. Janir noticed with concern that there was an unusually large number of bandits, 3 or 4 dozen attacking at once. More than half of the Queen's knights were combating the robbers as well. To the right, where the horses were picketed, Janir noticed 2 sulking figures making their way to the animals. One of them sidled up to Colbo and began untying the stallion's lead rope from the line. The steed shifted and nervously snorted at the stranger.
"What are they doing?"
Carlyle wondered, a curious edge in his voice.
"They're taking my horse," she snapped.
"And you're just going to let them?"
"What can I do?"
"I don't know. You're a bloody Argatalum. Do some strange and frightening Argatalum thing."
"Such as?" Janir snarled, attempting to push away the image of a body speared at the end of Armandius's sword. Weeks before, at the Revelis Peninsula, her brother had said she was powerful. She had been heady on all that power back in the chamber, but she didn't know how to use it to fight. She didn't even know if she could use it to fight.
"We need a plan," Carlyle decided. "How about this? I distract them, you get up behind and take them down."
Janir wasn't sure whether to gulp or smack him.
"Carlyle,
No." It wasn't so much the danger involved that held her back. She didn't want to hurt anyone. She never wanted to hurt anyone.
"So you're just going to let them swipe our horses, is that it?"
She remembered just in time to keep her voice down. The last thing they needed was to catch the robbers' attention.
"What do you mean, our? Carlyle!"
The enchanter wriggled out of her reach and went dashing headlong to enact his plan with or without her. Janir didn't dare shout lest she draw notice from the bandits, and she couldn't run fast enough to catch him in her traveling dress. In moments, Carlyle had closed the distance and taken up his post behind the wagon. He cast her a shrug. He was going to do it whether she helped him or not.
"Yoo-hoo!" Carlyle shouted, stepping from behind the wagon. For once, he sounded nervous. "Who's a cute little bunch of lassies in pigtails?"
The bandits stopped and muttered incomprehensibly. Their thick mountain accents were hard to understand.
"That's right." Carlyle nodded dramatically. "I'm talking to you, you bunch of—" Carlyle paused, searching for what to say next. "Steed-snatching sissies."
The bandits shouted coarse words back. Janir's heart pounded wildly as she fumbled to cover Carlyle's bumbling backside. "Idiot," she thought to herself. "Are you trying to get yourself and him killed? This is a stupid plan." But it was too late to back out now. She took up her place on the other side of the wagon, waiting for the bandits to pass. Her heart raced, her spine shivered. She needed to be quick if this was to work. Assuming this could work. What did she know about fighting? What exactly did she plan to do? Grasping a carcotton in each hand, Janir readied herself best she could. She was still frightened, but the usual sense of equilibrium seeped into her from her rods.
"Oh, what's this?" Carlyle put his fists on his hips and puffed out his narrow chest. "Are the damsels in distress?"
To add flourish, he squeaked in a high-pitched voice and fluttered his hands in the air.
"Help me! Help me!"
The ruffians grumbled unkind words back at Carlyle.
"I didn't hear you. You know, because your voices are so high-pitched."
Carlyle tauntingly cupped his hand to his ear.
"What's that?"
The bandits dropped the horse's reins and began moving on Carlyle.
"Oh dear, what are the lovely little ladies going to do, eh? Are they going to smother me in their pretty little skirts?"
Carlyle had the gall of a bull, that was to be sure. "We'll rip out your tongue and gouge out your eyes," one of the robbers growled in a thick brogue. He definitely sounded as if he had come from the north, the Highlands.
"Will you, my midget missus? But won't that get your little white lace gloves bloody?"
Carlyle had begun enjoying his part too much. Growling angrily, the bandits swaggered toward the enchanter. Janir's heart raced as she recognized the time was coming. The brigands drew closer to Carlyle. Janir gripped her carcotton tighter. The pair of robbers emerged to her view. The right moment was almost there. They must take just 2 steps further, and she would strike. It was them or Carlyle. 1, 2. Springing from the shadows, Janir drove her carcotton forcefully into the back of the closest brigand. The carcotton shrieked, he fell to the ground, and lay still. Janir tried to move around the incapacitated robber to reach the other, but the first grabbed her ankle and brandished a dirk. Janir had no choice. Her reaction was impulsive. Driving hard as she could, she jabbed him in the neck. He screamed as she ground the carcotton harder against his flesh. He collapsed to the earth, as dead as a severed head. It was the first time Janir had ever killed with her carcotton. There was a strange, momentous feeling that came with that realization. She almost described it as wondrous, but shoved the thought away as morbid. In her state of awed revulsion, Janir had forgotten the second bandit. He swung a heavy claymore. She caught most of the power of it on her right carcotton. Pain shot through her arm, from her fingertips to her elbow. She wanted to cry out, but had to concentrate on the brigand. Unable to wield it effectively, she dropped that carcotton and clenched the other, trying to avoid the swinging blade. He swept his iron blade sideways in an attempt to cut off her head. Janir ducked under the blade and drove her carcotton into his shoulder. The robber shouted as it stung him and reflexively dropped his weapon. But now that she had only one carcotton, the robber caught her and shoved her to the ground. He pinned her against the earth, reaching for her neck. Janir fought and kicked, but to no avail. He clenched her throat mercilessly, strangling her with both his hands.
"Leave her alone!"
shrieked Carlyle, leaping onto the brigand's shoulders and clawing viciously at the man's eyes. The ruffian screamed in pain and straightened to deal with Carlyle. Taking advantage of the situation, Janir snapped upright and drove her carcotton into his chest as hard as she could. He screamed in agony and within moments went limp. You have been listening to Broken Enchantments, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. Don't forget to check out my Patreon for early access to episodes, bonus content, and lots of patrons-only freebies. You can learn more at elizabethwheatley.com. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube. I'll see you next time.